First impressions are everything, and when you're trying to make an action horror game, it's crucial that the environment conveys the right tone from the start. G'day, I'm Jordan from It's Got Stealth, and welcome to the Samurai Unicorn development series. In this installment, we're going to pull out the building plans for the Goliath offices and go through the process of making an environment worth exploring. A common piece of wisdom in game design is to make your first level last, but what if you're trying to create the game in the order that the story unfolds? While I'd like to say a clear and comprehensive game design doc is the way to go, sometimes features will have to change, no matter how much you want to account for every possibility. So how do we try to anticipate the ways future mechanics will affect the game while making a highly detailed environment now? For me, the best option was to turn to the games that inspired me, the ones where the actual level design itself provided genuine joy and intrigue during the course of exploration. Resident Evil 2's Raccoon City Police Department, Ocarina of Time's dungeon design, Central Yarnum and the FromSoft level design as a whole are all major inspirations for the level design that we felt provided constant guidance in the early stages of this opening mission. From these influences, I made a series of sketches on grid paper for what would eventually become the Goliath offices. As I planned the level, I made sure to consider the number of unique rooms and encounters, the corridors that would break them up and provide moments of downtime, as well as the way it would loop around in order to create a sort of eureka moment, or at the very least a sense of progression when you are able to re-enter a familiar space with the means to open up new areas. On paper, the Goliath offices is the most simple layout we plan on having in the game, but it is intended to be a microcosm of the design philosophy that will be expanded upon as players progress through the story. With a reasonably solid plan for the level in mind, it was time for Adam to get to work on creating the level in our 3D software of choice.
During this transitional stage between working on Samurai Unicorn as an animated series and changing course towards making fully playable locations, there were a lot of instances where our old workflow led to a level design process that seems incredibly inefficient when compared to what is commonly done within game development. While future levels will most likely be made with a more modular workflow in mind, the Goliath offices started life as a fully modeled location in Cinema 4D that was imported into Unity as a complete level with little ability to adjust the layout once it was added to the scene. Because the abandoned offices was the first real location that we made for gameplay, Chloe and her controls and handling were still in early development. There were some variables that we didn't even know yet that were going to affect the player experience, like camera distance and field of view, so we had to be mindful of that in the environment design. We had a general layout in place for room and decor placement, but whether things were too claustrophobic or not remained to be seen. Some things needed to be refined, like the original archives room, where the shelves were too close together for Chloe to comfortably move between. Once the room sizes are finalized, they are laid out with their connecting hallways and corridors. The pieces are UV mapped to a pretty consistent texture pixel density, or texel for short. This basically defines how detailed the textures will be for a given surface and how visible the pixels in it are. The walls tend to be the most detailed, so those texels are smaller as the player can get right up close to them. The floors are slightly larger texel sizes, that is, lower resolution, but still enough to convey detail, like grates and plating. The ceilings are usually the least detailed, and therefore have the largest texels, because a lot of the detail work comes from light fixtures or other upper units, and it's the furthest from the camera. Key features of a room tend to be the heart of it, existing as a defined piece of architecture or content you interact with. Some rooms, like Dr. Stillman's, are entirely scattered in their key feature elements, where the whole room itself dictates the background story. Conversely, in the lower levels, the pumping room has far more direct, obvious set pieces that command attention. Smaller objects and reusable assets are used to fill out the space and help the environment feel lived in, but these larger key features like the turbines and main pump go a long way to making the purpose of a room feel integral to Goliath's power and capability. Since the very start of the project, when it was merely an ambitious attempt at an animated series, the smaller, modular, reusable assets were a core part of the environment design process. Having cross-location assets made was vital to getting anything done, as we didn't have dedicated environment team members or anything like that. It was just me modeling and texturing everything, so anything we could consistently use was a huge plus, from barrels and crates to skip bins, that is, dumpsters for our overseas friends. In a similar vein, a lot of the pipes that were initially designed for specific uses ended up being very handy for quickly adding detail to otherwise bland walls, which is not a bad thing in a cyberpunk style game where excessive pipes and cables are often a hallmark of the genre.
As the list of animations for the combat system expanded and the complexity of the project's programming needs grew, it became clear that Eric and Adam would need some extra hands when it came time to implement all the art assets being produced for our first level. With some much needed encouragement and guidance from Eric, I took my first steps into 3D software and embraced my new role as a set decorator and environment artist for the Goliath offices. Up until recently, I've mostly avoided working in 3D programs and assumed the barrier for entry was too high. But with this gentle push, I found a lot of my passion for miniature set building was easily transferable once I overcame the awkwardness of learning to navigate in Unity. Thanks to our slightly unusual pipeline, I find a lot of my job remarkably easy when it comes to thinking about and implementing the environment design in the Glyph offices. Often I have access to an almost complete list of assets that I can use to rapidly fill out and detail the environment. So the majority of my time in Unity becomes a mixture between physically placing the set deck and thinking about the believability of the world, or how small stories can be seeded throughout the environment by just arranging assets in specific ways. On reflection, a lot of this is going to seem blatantly obvious, but in almost every single room, I approach set deck from biggest to smallest. First, placing what we consider to be the main features of the room. For me, I view this as anything that either defines the purpose of the space or limits where someone is able to move in the environment. Next, I begin to work my way down through varying sizes of clutter that range from unique details for that area to objects that you'll see scattered throughout the rest of the level and beyond. By mixing these bespoke assets with more generic ones, the hope is that we can maintain the identity of the room while creating a unifying design that connects all of the spaces in a mission together. One of the last stages of the set deck process is going through and checking how the level feels to navigate, but also to find any organic sightlines that could lead to instances of environmental storytelling. At all times, we want these levels to be believable locations on the surface that invite and encourage the player to explore them in the way Chloe would as a detective. While I certainly try to achieve the majority of this subtle guidance with environment design, the rest is done through encounter design and the placement of specific pickup items, but we'll discuss that more in a future episode. With most of the set deck placed, I like to finish things off by looking at the walls and finding places that posters or signs might complement the space. In the Glyph offices, we made some very on-the-nose corporate propaganda, but in the upcoming basement areas, Ridge has been helping us make safety signs that allude to the building's true purpose.
Hey, Ridge here, illustrator for Sam Uni. Being tasked with creating safety signage befitting a megacorp like Goliath started out with rough concepts from Jordan, along with some inspiration of my own, namely, I wrote for PlayStation and a few CRT manuals of the era. Initially, I played a few PS1 games to see how the signs were rendered, as the signs needed to be identifiable and readable without becoming a pixelated mess, but allowing some minor instances of being intentionally illegible. I had to establish a set of style rules. Looking at Australian workplace standards for signage, I learned, for example, particular colours were not commonplace, or even allowed to be used, but when working at a cyberpunk world, you're allowed to twist the rules. After a few rough sketches done traditionally, we settled on some rules. Only yellow, red, black, and white for color, minimal to no use of circles, that squares and sharp edges would bring a more brutalist feel to the table, and the font of choice, Oxanium. I worked with vector-based programs for these signs, starting to break down in-game objects into simplified forms that would be easily recognizable, as well as developing a consistent language that at times felt oppressive, such as eyes open, or my personal favorite, no compensation.
Placing props and creating believable spaces in the environment is one thing, but until there's lighting, there isn't really a mood being set. That's where the choice of color and distribution of light becomes the most important part of defining what sort of atmosphere you're trying to achieve. In early versions of the Glyph offices, we leaned more towards a warmer, off-white tungsten that brought a lot of the richness out in the browns, but this didn't really capture the unsettling tone we were aiming for. So we stripped back our color palette to a green tinted fluorescent for the majority of the lights and kept a vibrant, cool red as a secondary color. This created a more sickly feeling atmosphere that boosted the idea of the dark secrets hidden within the office, while still having a punchy contrasting color to lead the eye towards specific areas of the environment. Once we settled on this color palette for the Glyph offices, it was easy to apply this philosophy to the rest of the game. In going forward, we're aiming to have each of the levels defined by a clear color palette that makes the environment distinct and easily recognizable.
It's a true staple of horror to play with lighting to emphasize important elements, define otherworldly shapes with chiaroscuro, that is, strong contrast between light and dark, or shroud mystery and pitch blackness. Incorporating flickering lights and dodgy circuitry means that we can lean into those influential design languages that everyone is already so familiar with. Adding this small amount of instability really drives home the point that at any moment the lights can go out and leave you in that abyss without knowing what is staring back. A big part of making the environments feel like holistic, real areas are the peripheral breathing elements you catch glimpses of, like hot steam emanating from vents, disturbed dust floating about, or a leaky pipe spewing a cascade of filth onto the floor. These atmospheric particles do a lot of the heavy lifting when it comes to delivering a moody, unnerving experience. The feeling that things aren't quite in order, or that, despite being long abandoned, the Goliath offices are still very much alive. We've played with the idea of reflective surfaces before, despite the art style not needing them to be physically calculated and simply painted into the textures. Our first foray into them being actual reflections with parallax was with the water puddles scattered around the offices. Using a reflection probe to capture the area around the puddle, this was baked in to add depth to an otherwise invisible bit of texture. The puddles are also tagged with a water layer, so they each contain special properties, like generating splashing sounds and animated ripples as Chloe makes contact with them.
Just getting to the point where the environment art is locked off is a huge undertaking, but it's not really the end of the story. The next step is making it into an actual level with encounters and interactive elements. In a future episode, we'll go through all the events and level design features that turn a nice piece of environment art into a playable level. After all, is it really a game without keys and doors? If you'd like to explore the environment yourself, consider supporting us on Patreon. Right now, all of our supporters can get access to the gunplay demo, with the Unicorn Combat demo expected to release later this year. Well, that will do us for this episode of the Dev Series. If you'd like to support the project, please wishlist the game on Steam and consider subscribing to our Patreon or joining the Samurai Unicorn Discord community. Until next time, thanks for watching.